So a little preamble. I almost always have an issue with videos that defend moral objectivity in that what they propose never seems to have any utility and doesn't seem to bring to the table the utility that I would hope that moral objectivity would be able to bring to the table. Instead, what they do effectively is they just abstract acts, take them in isolation and then tag a little plus or minus in front of them. That is next to useless. That is not how we talk about moral issues in the real world, because in the real world, the real substance of morality and moral discussion is moral dilemmas. And we don't take issues in isolation. Almost always, there are a whole basket, a whole slew of things that we have to entertain. There might be half a dozen goods and half a dozen negatives to any given situation. And we need to know something about the proportions and the strengths of these things. In some ways, you could analogize it to me mixing together some acids and some alkalis there. And I don't know whether it's safe for me to put my hand in the jar. Is it just going to melt the skin off, or will I be okay? And you say to me, I can objectively tell you that there are 5 acids and 3 alkalis in that jar. That's fucking useless. That is, frankly, apologies for the language, that is useless. Fucking useless. I need to know the quantities, I need to know the strengths, and I'd probably need to freshen up a little bit on my chemistry, which I haven't done for about 30 years, before I could know whether that was safe. Just knowing that there are so many acids and so many alkalis, bases, isn't particularly useful. And so it is with these moral discussions. If this is the problem, I'm going to play a video by a guy called Classical Theist. I'm going to object to the points that he makes. It's a good video though. It's called Objective Morality and God, a Response to CosmicSkeptic. But even if what he said was true, right, even if it's right, even if what he says is right and there is this kind of objectivity, I still don't see what it's gained us, because he still isn't giving us a mechanism whereupon we can scale different negatives, where we can scale different positives. It is still next to useless, I propose. Okay, that said, let me play you the first chunk of the video. As you can probably tell from the title, his video was a response to CosmicSkeptic. He was giving his views and his opinions on what CosmicSkeptic had to say. I'm going to do the same with him, and also with a couple of things that CosmicSkeptic says. Let's start with my little analysis.
Well, he put out a video. It's supposed to be, I think, one in a series that he's working on, basically on morality. And he comes from the standpoint that morality is subjective, and yet at the same time he doesn't consider himself a moral nihilist. And his position is quite unique in that he doesn't think that any system of ethics can truly, at the end of the day, be objective. So that includes theistic morality, and that's kind of the topic of the video I'm responding to. He thinks that theistic morality, even given the existence of God, even given the truth of one religious tradition, could not really be objective. And that's kind of why I wanted to respond to his video, because it seems to me that when he is talking about theistic morality, he's really only talking about divine command theory.
Okay, so look, it's always good to start with a bit of agreement, and there certainly is some agreement here. I think you're probably right that the vast majority of atheists, when they address these issues, and probably the vast majority of theists actually who give it some thought and engage on these issues, tend to adopt or tend to look at Christianity from that sort of divine command paradigm when assessing this business of moral objectivity from the theistic perspective. And that's right, and your perspective is a different perspective, and I acknowledge that, and we'll talk about that as the video progresses. I think you're wrong to say that CosmicSkeptic is unique in his position here. It's the same drum that I've been beating for about 10 years now, that I cannot see amongst the proposed characteristics of your God, or even any potential logically feasible characteristics, I can't see anything that that would provide the kind of foundation that I would need to see for what my understanding of morality is. And this is probably something that we have very different. We're talking in some ways at cross purposes because we have very different understandings of what morality is. Now, I think that I can evidence mine and provide some useful evidence as to why my understanding of what morality is probably along the right lines. Having watched your video, I still find yours entirely unevidenced. It just seems to be blind conjecture, really. Conjecture heaped upon more and more conjecture. I mean, from the divine command perspective, it generally runs along the lines of something like God is omnipotent, omniscient, transcendent, omnipresent. Ergo, his moral prescriptions are objective truths. But you need to go, there's a lot more steps there. The last bit has just been assumed. It's just been assumed that those characteristics lead to that. Yes, which is where you would say you differ. But we also need to look at the actual characteristics of morality itself, moral prescriptions, our moral statements, truth, apt. And we would all agree on some things, I think. Some things you talk about function later on in the video. Things that we agree have function, have purpose, and yet are subjective. Such as, for example, you maybe prefer a chicken sandwich. You find a chicken sandwich, a roast chicken sandwich, tastier than a ham sandwich. Now, we know that the sense of taste has function, but nonetheless, I think we would both agree, because we have an understanding of the function of taste and how it has arisen, that that is still a subjective judgment, and that there is no quality that is being ascribed to your God, or even any potential quality that could be ascribed to your God or to the nature of those sandwiches, which would make your judgment objectively wrong. I think we would all understand that even though taste has a purpose and a function, that your judgments of taste have a subjective element to them, and that there isn't something that will supersede your judgment and say, no, you're wrong to find a chicken sandwich tastier than a ham sandwich. A ham sandwich is objectively tastier, right? Because it isn't that kind of thing. And I think that's where the disagreement is kicking in here.
Now, as a natural law theorist, coming from St. Thomas's theory of natural law, I think this video is a really good opportunity to kind of show how natural law is immune from cosmic skeptics' criticism. And it really does allow you to have objective morality in a way that is not just as simple as the edicts of God's will, but is ultimately grounded in the very nature of things.
Okay, so you're going to sort of give me your account, and when I was watching this video through for the first time, there were two things that I thought I'd really like to see how these particular things pan out. I won't dress them up as questions as if, oh, let's see what's going to be said, because I've watched your video through 3 times now. It's kind of disingenuous to do that, but I want to tell you what my thoughts were at the time. The first was that I was interested to see whether what you described really did necessitate a deity, or whether you were describing something that the same foundation could be made without a deity. That was the first thing. And the second one, I was interested to see whether you actually evidenced your claim, or if effectively what you did is that you provided what I suppose you could say would be a legal defense, whereby the prosecution, of course, it's incumbent on the prosecution to evidence everything and to prove something beyond reasonable doubt, whereas all the defense has to do is to propose some kind of counter narrative, and as long as there's some kind of shred of possibility to that counter narrative, they don't have to actually evidence that that is what happened, just say, well, this is a counter narrative that could have happened, and they leave it at that. I was interested to see what would happen. Okay, I'll let you carry on.
I think morality is twofold. First, it entails a recognition that some things are good and others are bad. And secondly, and this isn't the same thing, an intuition that we ought to do that which is good and ought not do that which is bad.
I actually think that's a fair starting point. Even as a Thomist, the natural law is ultimately predicated upon the precept that, good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. So I think we're pretty good so far.
It brought a smile to my face when I first watched that, and it still does. Because this is the point, ironically, where I diverge from CosmicSkeptic, and I say in my thinking, and I say that ironically because this is the point where you still agree with him. And that's why it brought a smile to my face, because I understand why you still agree with him, because he is sympathetic. His perspective is still sympathetic to the religious perspective in terms of why we have a moral sense and what the business of that moral sense is, which is that he sees it that in the first instance it is about moral obligations to the self. It's about what we ought to do and ought not to do. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. It's certainly fundamentally wrong, I would propose, from an evolutionary paradigm, which I would assume is the paradigm that he is working from. I can give you a pass on that because I don't think you are. Right, I think you're working from some deistic perspective that God has imbued things with this moral sense, but that isn't the perspective that I'm working from, and that's not the perspective that he's working from. I think it's much more sensible from that perspective, viewing it from an evolutionary perspective. How did we evolve this moral sense, and what is it about, rather than viewing it about the self, about us gimping and enabling our own behaviours, that instead it is about how we influence the behaviours of others. It's not about saying what should I and shouldn't I do. It's about what moral prescription should I make to try and influence the behaviour of everybody else. So that in the first instance, it's not about the self, it's about everybody else. And when you view it in an evolutionary context and the way the contractarian way we have moral discussions and application within society, about when we look at other, not just other great apes, but other primates, and how they display a moral sense. Now, I know you take some issue with that and say, oh, well, they're not rational beings, they can't be moral agents. But from an evolutionary perspective, they are demonstrating moral behaviours, or rudimentary moral behaviours. Obviously they're not as complicated as ours, but they're still moral-like behaviours. Why are they doing it? They are doing it to influence the behaviour of other primates in their troop, not to limit their own behaviour. It's about impacting on the behaviours of others. So that is why we have developed it, because it's just a more sophisticated version of what they have, to reflect the fact that A, we can have a more sophisticated version of it and take better control over our social environment, but also the fact that our social environment is much more complex than their social environment, so we need a much more complex moral sense to take account of it. I can frame that in an evolutionary paradigm, and I think to some extent evidence that, and I would be surprised if CosmicSkeptic could do the same in terms of framing it in terms of the self. But I can certainly see why you're amenable to it, because it still fits in with this religious paradigm, doesn't it? For centuries of philosophical thought on moral philosophy have been framed in that religious paradigm. The Christian viewpoint in the West was the philosophical viewpoint on morality. And even as that started to shift, really it's only with the impact of evolutionary biology and evolutionary thinking and framing it in that evolutionary paradigm that we can start to consider what really is the business of morality in a moral sense. And that's where the divergence, I think, comes from in terms of my thinking in this instance compared to your thinking and CosmicSkeptic's.
Suffice it to say that, in my view, oughts are built into the very nature of the good itself. And this is because nature, on my view, is inherently teleological. That is to say, substances, natural things, by their very nature incline towards certain ends, the realization of which yield to their perfection and hence conform to the good. Thus, to participate in evil would not only be to avoid the good, but to fundamentally contradict one's own nature, because their nature already inclines toward their own perfection.
Okay, so I found this a really bold statement to make, actually bolder than it sounded, because underneath what, if you don't mind me saying so, seemed like kind of several veneers of ambiguous language, what I felt was you were dressing up 2 points as if they were 1 point. And the 2 points were that, one, kind of hiding the second point. The first point, which was that substances tended towards ends, I have nothing really to say about that. But the second point was that these ends are good. And there was no real discussion about that, really, about the limits of that. So I couldn't really decipher whether what you were saying was that these ends are good tautologically. In other words, whatever those ends are, they're good. Even if they're things that would seemingly be malevolent and quite abhorrent to us, if those are the ends, then they are good by dint of them being ends, and by achieving those ends, you've achieved perfection, and perfection is the good. Or whether you just made some kind of huge leap generally and we're just supposed to go along with the ride, just hope it all kind of works out. Couldn't really work that out, but it seemed like you were parceling that second bit in with never properly expanding it there.
It becomes very easy to define what is good and what is bad. Invariably, when we speak about something being good, we are ultimately referring to perfection.
I mean, yeah, like a perfect rapist, perfect serial killer, all good.
But what is perfection? That's the question. I don't think perfection can really be understood in any other way than this: the degree to which a thing properly conforms to its nature. Hence, and I use these examples many times, the eye is more perfect to the degree to which it's going to perform its function as an eye more or less perfectly.
So for me, this is really interesting stuff, this idea that something is good to the degree it performs its function. I want to explore that a little bit, because for the past 7 or 8 years, since I reached a point where I started to try and understand the moral sense from an evolutionary perspective, how it's evolved, why it's evolved, and what that tells us about morality and what it could be, what it is that we're actually referring to, and trying to frame it in that evolutionary paradigm. This has perhaps given the one little nugget of objectivity. Not objectivity in terms of actions, but in terms of the moral prescriptions that we make. In other words, I might not be able to say this is objectively wrong, this is objectively right, but I think what we can say is that in some instances, some moral prescriptions are objectively the right moral prescriptions to make, given the purpose that we evolved our moral sense in the first place. In other words, if we evolved the moral sense in the first place to try and manipulate our social environment to our advantage and the environment of those that are closest to us, then certain moral prescriptions that we make are going to work towards that, and certain moral prescriptions, if we were to make them, would clearly work against them. So I think we can divine a little bit of objectivity there. But note, that kind of objectivity is not the same as saying those actions themselves that are being so described are right or wrong. It doesn't require any intrinsic moral properties of the acts themselves. And the other thing that is important to realise is just how specific it is, how contingent it is on our own evolutionary history as a very social ape with a complex social structure. If we were to hypothesize a species of hyper-intelligent crocodilians evolving over the next 2 or 3 million years, crocodiles, of course, have a very different social structure, much less social animals than we are. You can well imagine that the moral prescriptions that those crocodilians would make to one another would be very different to the moral prescriptions that we make to one another with the kind of social and mating arrangements that we have. But I don't think that it would be right to say that ours are objectively right and theirs are objectively wrong. Those prescriptions that the crocodiles make would be just as right for crocodiles and crocodilian society such as it was as ours would be for our society. And here's another issue, and please try and get your noggin around this one. I'll try and be as clear in setting this out as I can be, but this is a difficult one to run through. At least I find it a difficult one to run through. So it could well be, let's say, let me take on board what you say, that we have a function to do what is morally right, or that we have a moral sense that urges us towards doing personally what is morally right. But let me say, even if that is the case, in no way does that give us any indication of what is objectively the right thing to do, nor does it give us any indication, in fact, more importantly, that there is an objectively right thing to do. The point that I'm making is that it could all be entirely illusory, that we have that moral sensation that there is something that we can edge towards that is the morally perfect or right thing to do, but it's entirely illusory. Now, that might not sound very convincing, and I can understand that. So let me give you another example. Let me give you another bodily example. I know you majored on bodily examples. Let me give you another bodily example of something that exactly fulfills what I'm talking about here. That doesn't prove that it's true of morality as well, but it does demonstrate proof of concept. So what I want to go back to is our sense of taste, a sensation, a quale, right? Our sensation of taste of food is not something that is intrinsic to the food we're eating. It's experiential for us and how we experience those different foodstuffs. But if we take your reckoning on board, we have a sense of taste. A perfect sense of taste would be a sense of taste that was capable of picking out an objectively perfect tasting foodstuff. I think you can see the problem here is that there is no such thing as an objectively perfectly tasting foodstuff, and to suggest there is to label under a misunderstanding, is to labour under a misunderstanding of what taste is all about. Taste is a subjective experience, and in many ways, if we were really to talk about a perfect sense of taste, we'd need to look at the deeper function of taste, and probably a perfect sense of taste, I propose, would be a sense of taste that made sure that we always ate foodstuffs which were the most nutritious for us, always attracted to those foodstuffs, and never attracted to foodstuffs which were harmful, toxic, poisonous, what have you. That would be a perfect sense of taste. So I hope you can see the point here. Proof of concept, if you like. And the reason that you get this proof of concept is because, in terms of taste, we have an understanding of the evolutionary underpinnings of what has given us that sense of taste and why we have that sense of taste and the true function and purpose of why we have it. And so this is the point. Just because a taste sense does not imply, just the fact that we have a taste sense does not imply that there are objectively perfect tasting foodstuffs out there. Neither, I propose, does the fact we have a moral sense imply that there are objectively moral actions out there. And I propose that what we need to do in each case is to draw back the curtain, sort of Wizard of Oz style, and observe what is going on behind the scenes. I can tell you what's going on behind the scenes. It's the process of evolution. It's evolutionary pressure. It is adaptation to those selection pressures is what is going on. But I'm sure that with the example of taste, that you would withdraw that curtain, you would pull back the curtain, and you would see what was actually going on. But I think what you're choosing to do with regard to morality is keep that curtain firmly drawn, and you're still just observing all the explosions and the voice of the mighty Oz. And so the conclusions you're drawing with regard to function and perfection of function are erroneous as a result.
So, for example, when a dog fulfills its appetite by eating its dinner, this is an instance of the dog procuring for itself its own good. But I would also agree that we wouldn't call this morality because the dog isn't a rational creature. Nevertheless, ontologically, a dog eating its food, a tree taking its nutrients, an irrational creature exercising, for example, the virtue of prudence, these are all unified as common instantiations of the good, but at different hierarchical levels of the chain of being.
Okay, so I'm stopping it there. This little chunk, I'd missed a couple of minutes out, followed on from quite an extended, long-winded in some ways chunk where what Classical Theist had done was to try and tie together ideas of nature through to the good by going through a sort of string of action and perfection and all this kind of thing. And to cut to the chase, this is what he's suggesting, that doing what is in your nature and your function is to achieve the good. And although it might not be a moral good in a dog because he doesn't regard the dog as a moral agent, we are. So when we fulfill it, it is a moral good. But never anywhere in this segment or in the video taken its entirety, and I listened through it 3 times, trying to pick this out, was there any discussion of a malevolent nature and how you would deal with malevolent aspects of one's nature, because surely this has to be dealt with, because to make a carte blanche statement that if it's in your nature and you fulfill it, then you're fulfilling your function, which is a good, and in our case that's a moral good, you really do need to take account of that, don't you? Unless you intend to make some kind of tautological argument where it really doesn't matter what you do, if it's in your nature to do it and you do it, however abhorrent that seems to us, we're going to regard it as a good. We do have some reason from different fronts, I think, to suspect that there are these examples, that we're not all perfect in our nature, that we're not all sweetness and light as a species. The Evo-Psych Brigade, regardless of what you feel about them, have made some reasonably cogent arguments as to why things as diverse as rape amongst males or cuckoldry amongst women may have been evolutionary selected for. When I talk about cuckoldry, I'm not talking about a guy sat in his wardrobe wanking away, watching through the crack of somebody smashing into his wife on the bed there, right? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a woman who tries to maximize her resources to bring up her children by being in a relationship with a man of means who has the resources to bring her children up, but then getting impregnated by another male who presumably has better genetics physically or what have you. And there's suggestions from Evo-Psych that these have been selected for. Even if you're not convinced by those, there are plenty of other ones, some of them more basic, as to why we might be predisposed towards things such as violence, etc. Now, are you suggesting, therefore, that if that is true, that carrying out the perfect rape would be a moral good because it's fulfilling the function of something that is intrinsic to us? I would think that you are not saying that. We could also look at some of the claims by geneticists that we are predisposed towards certain characteristics such as, again, aggression, depression, violence, a short temper, towards stealing. And indeed, this is exactly what we see. We can't carry out the experiments we really need to carry out in humans, which would be selective breeding programs, but we've carried out selective breeding programs in other animals, and we've been very successful in breeding out behavioral characteristics as well as physical characteristics. Indeed, if you look at the domestic dog, you can see just what an array of different behavioral characteristics we've managed to winnow out from one single species, the wolf. And so that's kind of interesting, that, isn't it? Because what it suggests is, somewhat incontrovertibly, I would say, at this stage, that some of these negative characteristics are undoubtedly intrinsic within individuals. So if you're an individual that is predisposed towards violence, let us say, then that is in your nature, and according to the logic that you're giving here, and you haven't given any reason to just set it all on one side and not the other, it would therefore be a moral good for such a person to be violent. And if they could be perfectly violent, then that would be perfectly good. Now, I'm assuming you don't believe that you're not taking a definition of good that is tautological in that sense, but you need to find a way of managing that. And finally, with regard to that, a little birdie told me that you are morally opposed to homosexuality, which is kind of interesting, that, isn't it? Because surely from your perspective, if somebody is inclined towards homosexuality, if it appears to be within their nature, if they seem to be sexually attractive to people of the same sex, then surely the morally good thing, using your reasoning, would be for them to act on that. Surely if you are a gay man, the morally righteous thing to do would be to go and try and get as much cock as you can manage, given the stance that you have taken here. I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on that, Classical Theist. So as to the rest of the video, and I don't want to play any clips on the rest of the video, there was about another 5 minutes, and without wanting to sound cruel, to me it sounded like ambiguous, vague waffle, really. It was like 5 minutes of what came across to me as unsubstantiated, unevidenced claims about the nature of God and about our world generally, that seemingly, if I'm being cynical, it seemed as if you were making those arguments not on the basis of any evidence or any decent reason to adopt those positions, but rather because adopting those characteristics of God and the world allowed you to substantiate the arguments that you were making, which is obviously putting the cart before the horse. It's the equivalent to saying morality is objective because of God. Okay, so what properties would God need to make that true? Okay, these are the properties. Right, these are the properties that God has. Right, these are the properties that God has. You're trying to backfill, reverse engineer your argument, and that is really how it feels when I listen to that, because it's all absolutely unsubstantiated, really. And this was the problem, right? Look at it from my perspective. I think that the model that I have, that I've presented in some very rough sketched out detail here, provides at least a kind of workable semi-evidenced model as to what our moral sense is about, why we make moral prescriptions, what the business of morality is, and that helps us to explain observed behaviour, not just in human beings, but in other primates that exhibit rudimentary moral behaviours. Your explanation does absolutely nothing of that. In fact, quite the opposite. It seems that half the behaviours we do seem to fulfil functions which would be perfectly moral goods according to your explanation, but obviously aren't because you don't regard them as moral goods. So it seemed to me like what you were making is a legal defence, really, a sort of wholly unevidenced, incredible legal defense, and that makes me scratch my head a little bit. I mean, I can understand from a philosophical perspective why you would do that, right? Because like with a legal defense, you don't have to provide any evidence. All you need to do is to provide sufficient doubt on the prosecution's narrative, my narrative version of events, to show that there is another conceivable narrative, another possibility. You don't have to evidence that possibility, right, to still leave open that window of doubt. I get that. So I get why from a philosophical perspective you could make the argument, but it doesn't explain why you would actually believe it, why you would actually believe that argument, that narrative, rather than a narrative that can be fleshed out, that seems to fit in with the facts of the world as we can observe them. So I really found it pretty weak stuff, if I'm being honest, especially the last part of the video. Something else that you claimed, you went at some sort of the length of something that had gone on for quite some time, a minute or so, as you said, and so that's why God is necessary and why this wouldn't work without God. But I just didn't work that out. From the first principles that you gave, it's about fulfilling a function. It's about fulfilling something that is within your nature. And if you do that, to the perfect degree, then as far as you're concerned, in a sentient moral agent, then that is perfectly morally good to do so. But you didn't give any reason why that cannot take place in the context of there being no God. I've given you what I think is a workable reason to believe that it could, that a moral sense can develop from evolutionary principles, that it doesn't require a God to imbue us with a moral sense and moral reasoning, that it can just arrive spontaneously as a result of adaptive evolutionary pressures. So why I'm still none the wiser where a God fits into this, even if this claimed objectivity exists and fulfilling what is within your nature to its perfect potential is perfectly morally good. Even if I accepted that, I don't really see the necessity of a deity in any of that description. Okay, so I think I want to sum up at this point, and I wrote down here, in actual fact, that fundamentally I found your presentation hollow. And I think that's unfair, actually, because it wasn't hollow. But what I did find is that it didn't, from my perspective, cohere or comport to what I see out there in reality. It seemed to be structured around this idea that what is good, something is good to the degree it performs its function, and I just don't buy that works for moral agents and moral agency. Nowhere did you deal or differentiate the benevolent from the malevolent in terms of agency or actions. And that's got to be a real problem for you. I mean, how do you, I don't know if you believe in the devil, but if it's in the devil's nature to do evil acts, then isn't it perfectly good for him to do those evil acts because it's in his nature? It's paradoxical. Well, even if you don't believe that about the devil, let's take a more classical approach. That he's an antagonist of God, that the devil is there to oppose God. So if he opposes God, that is in his nature. So it's morally good to oppose God. Is it to go against God's will? And it seemed kind of ironic to me, and this is the last point that I'm going to make, but that you, somebody who's taking a position, trying to support, in fact, prop up a position of moral objectivism and appeal to a realm of moral facts, take the position of moral realism, is appealing to something that fundamentally seems to take a much more relativist approach, that effectively what you're doing is you're appealing to individual moral agents' nature, when we know that individual moral agents are predisposed towards behaviourally and in terms of their attitude towards very, very different things. And so fulfilling those different natures means different moral solutions, different moral outcomes. How can there be a realm of moral facts that exists apart from us? That is not dependent upon us and our nature, which is what you require in terms of moral objectivism, if you're appealing to the specifics and the idiosyncrasies of the individual moral agent. Okay, very interested to know what people say in comments. I know that there will be other people within the sort of great debate community that are interested in these issues that will watch this video. Interested to know what you have to say. Make a video on this. If you like, let's hear what other people have to say with regard to this, and obviously interested to know what Classical Theist has to say. I invite all of you to go and watch the original video. That's always the best thing to do. I can only play you a few select chunks of it. Be aware of that, and I try not to misrepresent things, but it's difficult because obviously I only have my interpretation of what another person means, and that's up to me. That's reliant on me. I can only do what I do in good faith. Doesn't mean that I always get it right. Okay, well, thank you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this, and bye for now.